Trapped in a rusted tin room, a kidnapped teacher doesn't beg. She rips a brass pipe from the sink and shatters her guard's hand. She demonstrates that true autonomy isn't about having all the power, but deciding that nobody else gets to hold the pen while your story is being written. Love strong, independent heroines, smash like, share this short, and subscribe to join our community.
The wind off Lake Michigan in late November didn't just bite, it sliced. It carried the scent of frozen iron, wet concrete, and the distinct, suffocating aroma of old oil. Down in the sub-basement of Meridian Tower, the temperature was holding steady at 8 below. Eleanor Crawford pressed her spine against the cold concrete pillar, her breath rising in shallow, erratic plumes of white mist. She squeezed her eyes shut. Listen, she told herself. Just listen. Thud, thud. Thud. It wasn't a frantic pace, it was a heavy rhythmic stride. The sound of handmade leather dress shoes, striking the stained garage floor with absolute certainty. It was the walk of a man who had never in his life braced himself for a closed door, because he knew the world simply parted for him. Ellie's fingers ached. They were locked around a thick, crumpled manila folder, clutching it to her chest like a shield. Inside those papers was the ugly truth. 6 hours ago, she had been sitting in the cramped, radiator-groaning office of the Open Page Foundation, the adult literacy nonprofit where she spent her days teaching people how to write their own names. She had been checking the quarterly ledgers. She hadn't expected to find a phantom pipeline, 2.3 million, systematically washed through dummy accounts over 14 months. And sitting at the center of the web, signed in that sharp, arrogant cursive she'd know anywhere, was Garrison Hart, her ex-husband. The brilliant corporate defense attorney who had discarded her the second he made partner because a modest schoolteacher no longer fit his high society aesthetic. He hadn't just stolen her 20s, he was using her sanctuary to wash blood money for a cartel. Then came the burner text on her phone. Drop the files, go home, forget it, this is your only warning. She hadn't dropped them, she had run now. Her phone was dead, her car wouldn't start. And the shadows on the garage floor were stretching out like long, black fingers, closing in. The elevator doors at the far end of Executive Row hissed open with a soft, expensive chime. Callum Vance stepped out into the dim, yellow-hued subterranean air. He was a towering silhouette, draped in a long, bespoke charcoal mong toe coat that caught the draft. He was adjusting a silver cufflink, his mind still running the numbers on an $800 million port acquisition he'd just closed on the 45th floor. His face was a mask of chiseled stone, unreadable, clinical, detached. He didn't see her, not at first. Ellie didn't think. If she thought, she would freeze, and if she froze, she was dead. She lunged out from behind the pillar, her worn boots skidding slightly on the slick concrete. She caught his right wrist. Her hand was microscopic against his heavy, scarred forearm. Please, she whispered, her voice raw, fractured by the cold. Don't make a sound, they're already inside. In 2 seconds, Callum Vance didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. His body went entirely rigid, a predator assessing an anomaly. His icy gray eyes dropped to her hand on his wrist, then tracked up to her face, wet chestnut hair clinging to her cheeks. A torn sleeve on her cheap winter coat, knuckles white around a stack of papers. But it was her eyes that made him pause, hazel, wide. Terrified, yes, but calculating. She wasn't begging him to be her savior, she was studying him, measuring his weight, deciding if he was a man who could be trusted. Callum hadn't been looked at with that kind of raw, independent scrutiny since he was a 12-year-old boy, standing over his mother's casket. Behind them, the heavy steel fire doors gritted open. 3 men stepped into the garage, heavy jackets, hands buried deep in their pockets, gripping shapes that didn't belong in a business district. Reznov's men, Thomas, Callum's younger brother, immediately reached inside his own jacket, his jaw tightening as the rest of the security detail moved to form a wall. Callum raised one large, gloved hand, a single, dismissive gesture. Thomas stopped. The guards held their ground. With a slow, deliberate movement, Callum stepped sideways, his broad shoulders and massive frame completely eclipsed Ellie, tucking her into the shadow of his coat. He stood like a monument of solid granite, cutting off the wind, cutting off the threat. The lead enforcer stopped 10 feet away, his eyes darting to Callum's face. Recognition flickering into sudden uneasy compliance, Mr. Vance. The man stammered, pulling his hand slightly out of his pocket. We didn't know this was your floor. We're just tracking a thief. Corporate peace. She took something that belongs to our boss. The silence in the garage stretched, heavy and suffocating. Callum let it hang there until the enforcer began to sweat in the sub-zero air. When Callum finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the concrete floor. When did the West Side forget the rules of engagement? Callum asked, his cadence slow, almost conversational, yet dripping with a lethal weight. Weapons are not drawn on unarmed women in my house. You turn around and you walk out of this building right now, before I teach you the true cost of violating human dignity. The enforcer swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. Mr. Reznov won't be happy, sir. Then tell Dmitri to call me himself, Callum replied, his gaze unblinking, and remind him that in Chicago, a man who hunts the defenseless because he's too weak to fight his own battles isn't a businessman. He's a coward. Now get out. The three men backed away, their boots clicking rapidly against the floor until the fire doors slammed shut behind them. The silence returned, punctuated only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation. Callum didn't turn around to look at Ellie. He didn't ask her if she was okay. He didn't ask what was in the folder she was holding, like a life vest. He simply reached out, his large hand grasping the handle of his armored black SUV, and pulled the heavy door open. He glanced back over his shoulder, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a quiet, unyielding intensity. Get in, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Ellie stood there for one heartbeat, her breath catching in her throat. She had spent the last 14 months promising herself she would never again let a powerful, controlling man dictate her steps. But as she looked at Callum Vance, she saw no mockery in his face, no hidden agenda, just a cold, protective wall of iron. She took a breath, tightened her grip on the files, and stepped up into the vehicle. The 47th floor did not smell like Chicago. Chicago smelled of wet asphalt, roasting coffee beans, and diesel exhaust. Up here, behind 3-inch thick tempered glass, the world smelled of expensive isolation. Polished cedar, smoked marble, a faint, clinical hint of ozone from a high-end air filtration system. It was a museum disguised as a home. Or maybe a fortress disguised as a penthouse. Ellie sat on the edge of a charcoal gray leather sofa. Her posture was straight, rigid, the habit of a schoolteacher who spent a decade telling 8-year-olds to keep their spines aligned. Her boots, salt-stained and leaking a slow puddle of gray slush onto the immaculate stone floor, felt like a crime. Across the room, Callum Vance unbuttoned his heavy wool coat. He didn't drop it onto a chair, he handed it to Martha, a woman with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had witnessed the birth and death of 3 different empires. Martha didn't look at Ellie with pity. She didn't look at her with suspicion, either. She just looked. Then she disappeared into the kitchen, her footsteps making no sound on the rugs. Callum walked to a massive slab of black walnut that served as his desk. He didn't sit down. He tossed the crumpled manila folder Ellie had been clutching onto the wood. The sound was loud, like a gunshot in a library. You're shaking, Callum said. His voice was a low, dry rasp. The heater in my car has been broken since October, Ellie replied. Her jaw ached from clenching it. I'm used to it, Martha returned, setting a steaming porcelain mug on the low table in front of Ellie. The scent of black tea and lemon rose into the air. Ellie didn't touch it. She kept her hands folded in her lap. To take the tea was to accept the hospitality. To accept the hospitality was to admit she was a guest. She wasn't a guest. She was a woman hiding from a man who wanted her dead. Callum noticed. His gray eyes drifted down to the untouched mug, then back to her face. He didn't push. He picked up the folder, flipped it open, and began to read. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the penthouse was the crisp, rhythmic snap of paper being turned. Callum read the way a machine processes code. His face didn't move. A muscle in his jaw twitched once when he hit the 3rd page, the page detailing the shell companies registered in Delaware, but that was it. Finally, he closed the folder. He leaned back against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. Garrison Hart, Callum said. He's thorough. He's a narcissist, Ellie said, her voice dropping an octave. Thoroughness is just a side effect of his vanity. He thinks he's too smart to get caught. He is too smart to get caught, Callum corrected her. His tone was flat, devoid of judgment, by the IRS, by the federal prosecutors. He used your charity because he knew the audit profile for an adult literacy program in the South Side is virtually zero. He didn't just hide the money, Eleanor. He hid behind your reputation. The words hit her like a physical blow. It was one thing to suspect it. It was another to hear a man like Callum Vance lay it out like an autopsy report. I want to go home, Ellie said, standing up. Her knees were weak, but she forced them to lock. I have a lesson plan to finish for Monday. My sister, you don't have a home anymore, Callum said. He didn't say it to be cruel. He said it the way a doctor tells a patient the leg has to come off. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black tablet, and slid it across the marble desk. Ellie walked over. Her fingers trailed the edge of the wood before she picked up the device. The screen showed a grainy, high-definition security feed. It was the alleyway behind her apartment building in Pilsen. Two men in dark jackets were tossing cardboard boxes out of her laboratory window, smashed lamps, torn pillows, a crate of old textbooks she'd kept from her first year of teaching, their pages fluttering in the wind like dead birds. Her stomach turned over. That was her life. 9 years of marriage dissolved into a tiny apartment. And now the apartment was being gutted by strangers. They're looking for the ledger, Callum said, his voice coming from right behind her shoulder. He had moved without her hearing him. He was a big man, but he moved like oil on water. They'll realize you don't have it. Then they'll start looking for the sister. Clara, Ellie whispered, the tablet trembling in her hand. She's at the university. She doesn't know anything about this. She doesn't need to know anything to be leverage, Callum said. He reached out, his large, scarred hand taking the tablet back from her. His skin was warm, infinitely steady. I have 2 men outside her dorm. They've been there since you got into my car. She's safe. For now. Ellie turned to face him. The proximity was overwhelming. He smelled of cedar and old paper. Why? She demanded. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why are you keeping my sister safe? Callum looked down at her. His eyes were the color of the lake before a blizzard. Because a system that allows the innocent to be used as collateral is a broken system, Callum said. His voice was a steady, rhythmic cadence. Garrison Hart thinks he can leverage your terror because he views you as an extension of his property. I don't operate that way, Eleanor. In this city, my word is the law, and my law says that no man has the right to strip another human being of their autonomy. You stay here because here, you are not a pawn, you are a person. Ellie stared at him. She was looking for the catch, the hidden fee, with Garrison. Every nice gesture was a loan that had to be repaid with interest, usually in the form of her own self-esteem. I don't trust you, she said. Good, Callum replied. He turned back to his desk. Trust is a liability in this town. I don't want your trust. I want your compliance until I can take your ex-husband off the board. He walked toward his private quarters, his shadow long against the marble. Martha will show you to the guest room, he said over his shoulder. Don't touch the windows, they're wired. By 3:00 a.m., the penthouse was dark, save for the blue ambient light of the city bleeding through the massive glass panes. Ellie couldn't sleep. The bed in the guest room was too large, too soft, too quiet. It felt like a trap designed to make her lower her guard. She walked out into the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the stone. She stood by the sink, using the ambient light to wash a small scrape on her palm. She'd cut it on a rusty bolt while scrambling behind the concrete pillar in the garage. It wasn't deep, but it was angry, red, pounding with her heartbeat. She was clumsy with the paper towel, trying to hold pressure while her hands shook from residual adrenaline. A shadow fell across the kitchen island. Callum was standing there. He had discarded his suit jacket. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. The sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms, corded with muscle and crisscrossed with old, jagged white lines. He didn't ask for permission. He walked over to the built-in medical cabinet, pulled out a brown bottle of antiseptic and a roll of sterile gauze, and sat down on a stool by the island. Sit, he said. Ellie hesitated, then she sat. Callum took her hand, his palms were rough. calloused from years of labor before he ever sat in an executive chair. But his touch was light. He poured the antiseptic onto a cotton pad. "This will burn," he said. "I can handle it," she replied. He pressed the pad to her palm. It felt like liquid fire. Ellie didn't pull away. She clamped her teeth together, her eyes locking onto his face. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the wound. He wiped the blood away with a rhythmic sweeping motion. Swipe. Pause. Swipe. "You're good at this," Ellie muttered, trying to distract herself from the stinging. "I've had a lot of practice," Callum said. He began to wrap the gauze around her hand, his fingers moving with absolute efficiency, not too tight, not too loose. "When I was 16, if I didn't learn how to patch myself up, I bled out in an alley. The city doesn't call an ambulance for boys from my neighborhood." He clipped the edge of the bandage, then finally looked up. His face was inches from hers. "You didn't cry," he noted. "I cried for 9 years, Mr. Vance," Ellie said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I ran out of tears about 14 months ago. Physical pain is easy. It tells you exactly where it hurts, and it stops eventually." Callum's expression softened. It was a microscopic change, a loosening of the tension around his mouth, but to a woman who had spent a decade reading the shifts in a volatile man's face, it was as loud as a shout. He stood up, recapping the antiseptic. "Mr. Vance," Ellie called out as he reached the edge of the kitchen. He paused. He didn't turn around. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The things you had to do to get to the 47th floor." The silence stretched for 5 long beats. The refrigerator hummed. The wind battered the glass outside. "Every single day." "Eleanor," Callum said. His voice was lower than before, almost swallowed by the dark. "But regret is a luxury for people who had a choice. Go to sleep." The next 4 days were an exercise in structured isolation. Callum Vance was a ghost who lived by a schedule. He was gone before the sun cleared the horizon over the lake, leaving behind nothing but the scent of coffee and the faint vibration of the elevator cables. He returned long after the city lights had turned into a neon blur. Ellie adjusted the only way a teacher knew how. She created a curriculum for her captivity. In the mornings, she helped Martha. She learned that Martha had been with the Vance family since Callum was a boy. She learned that Martha knew exactly how many sugars Callum took in his espresso, none, and which side of his ribs had been cracked by a rival enforcer's pipe 3 winters ago, the left. In the afternoons, Ellie retreated to the library. It was a massive room, lined with dark oak shelves that stretched to the ceiling. Most of the volumes were leather-bound histories of warfare, treatises on Roman law, and financial ledgers that looked dense enough to stop a bullet. But on the 3rd day, hiding in the bottom drawer of an antique desk, Ellie found an anomaly. It was a children's primary reader. The cover was faded blue cloth, the corners bitten away by time. "The Golden Road to Literacy." Ellie opened it. The pages were thick, smelling of vanilla and old dust. On the inside cover, written in a delicate, flowing script that looked nothing like Callum's heavy block printing, was a name: Maria Vance. Throughout the book, there were notes in the margins. Thomas struggles with the long O. Callum knows the words but refuses to read them aloud if he thinks someone is watching. Ellie touched the ink. It was old, faded to a dull. She was a teacher, a voice said from the doorway. Ellie jumped. Callum was leaning against the frame. He was wearing a dark gray suit, but his tie was gone, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked tired. Not the exhaustion of a man who needed sleep, but the deep, bone-weary fatigue of a man who had been fighting a war for 28 years without a truce. "I didn't mean to pry," Ellie said, quickly closing the book. "You're not prying," Callum said, walking into the room. He didn't look at the shelves. He looked at the little blue book in her lap. She ran a clinic on 26th Street, taught steelworkers and immigrants how to read the fine print on their contracts, so the foreman couldn't cheat them out of their wages. "She sounds remarkable," Ellie said. "She was dangerous," Callum replied, his voice flat. "In our world, knowledge is a weapon. If you teach a man how to read, you teach him how to question." "My father didn't like questions." He sat down in the leather armchair opposite her. He looked at her bandaged hand. "How is the palm?" "It's fine. It doesn't sting anymore." Ellie set the children's book on the table between them. "Why do you keep it in the bottom drawer?" Callum leaned back, his long legs stretching out. Because reminders of what you lost can make your hand shake, he said. He looked directly into her eyes, his gaze steady. A man in my position cannot afford to have his hand shake. In the world I inhabit, weakness isn't just exploited, it's fatal. I keep her book because it reminds me of the value of what she died for. But I keep it hidden because if my enemies know what I care about, they know where to drive the knife. Ellie felt a strange, cold knot form in her chest. That's a terrible way to live, she said. It's not a life, Callum agreed. It's a preservation strategy. There is a difference. That night, the blizzard finally broke over Chicago. The wind howled against the 47th floor glass, a screeching, metallic sound that made the massive structure groan. Ellie woke up at 2:15 a.m. to a noise that didn't belong to the storm. It was a choked, ragged gasp, like a man trying to breathe through water. She got out of bed, her flannel nightshirt dragging against her shins. She followed the sound down the long, dim hallway to Calamus' master suite. The double doors were open, the room was vast, dark, and almost entirely empty. No television, no dresser, just a massive king-sized bed against the far wall. Callum was tangled in the white sheets. His bare torso was slick with sweat, the heavy muscles of his back bunching and releasing in violent, erratic spasms. His head was thrown back. His jaw locked so tight, the tendons in his neck looked like steel cables. He wasn't screaming, he was trying not to scream. He was fighting an enemy that wasn't there. Ellie didn't stop to think about the danger. She walked across the room, her bare feet silent on the rug. She didn't touch him. She knew enough about trauma to know that grabbing a sleeping soldier was a good way to get your neck broken. Instead, she sat down on the heavy wooden bench at the foot of his bed. She took a deep breath, cleared her throat, and began to speak. Her voice was low, steady, and shot through with the rhythmic, patient cadence she used when the afternoon sun was hitting the classroom, and 20 children were starting to lose their minds. "The snow is falling on Michigan Avenue," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of his ragged breathing. "It's thick, it's quiet, it covers the gray concrete until everything looks like a clean sheet of paper. Tomorrow morning, the snowplows will come out from the yards on 31st Street. They have yellow lights that flash against the brick walls. Flash. Pause. Flash." Callum's shoulders dropped an inch. His fingers relaxed their grip on the mattress. "In the spring," Ellie continued, her voice never wavering. "The wind shifts to the south. It brings the smell of the plains. The cherry blossoms in the park, behind the museum, come out 2 weeks late because the lake keeps the air cold. But when they open, they re-pink. Brilliant. No one goes to see them because they're hidden behind the old stone columns, but they're there anyway. They don't need an audience to bloom." The room was silent save for her voice. Callum's eyes cracked open. They weren't the icy gray of the businessman or the lethal stone of the boss. They were dark, deep, wide with the residual horror of a 12-year-old boy who had just watched his mother's car go over the side of the bridge. He didn't move. He lay there, his chest rising and falling in a slow, normal rhythm, staring at her silhouette against the window. "You're here," he whispered. His voice was raw, destroyed. "I'm here," Ellie said softly. "You shouldn't be," he said, but he didn't tell her to leave. The next morning, the sun came up bright and blinding over the white-sheeted city. Ellie walked into the kitchen at 8:00 a.m. Callum was already there. He was fully dressed, dark navy suit, crisp white shirt, silver tie. He was standing by the counter, his back to her, drinking an espresso. He looked entirely normal. The monster from 2:00 a.m. had been locked back into its cage, the iron bars reinforced with custom tailoring. "Martha went to the market," Callum said without turning around. "The coffee is fresh." Ellie walked over and poured herself a cup. She noticed her mug was already set out. Beside it was a small, white ceramic saucer with a single pinch of sea salt on it. She looked up at him. "You remembered," she said. "I don't forget details, Eleanor," Callum said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were clear. The gray was back, hard and impenetrable. "It's my job," before she could answer. His private cell phone vibrated on the marble island. He picked it up, his face instantly turning into a block of granite as he listened to the voice on the other end. He didn't speak for 2 minutes, he just listened. When he hung up, he looked at Ellie. "Your ex-husband just filed a motion in probate court," Callum said. his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register. He trying to freeze your sister's medical school trust fund. He claiming the money was derived from the charity's accounts. Ellie's coffee mug hit the counter with a sharp clatter. He can't do that. That money came from our grandmother. It has nothing to do with the Open Page Foundation. He knows that, Callum said. He reached for his suit coat. But Garrison Hart isn't trying to win a legal argument. Eleanor, he says, trying to create a narrative of shame. He wants to make you look like a criminal, so the city will stop looking at him. He thinks that if he humiliates you enough, you'll crawl back to him just to make the noise stop. He doesn't understand that a person's dignity isn't something that can be dissolved by a judge's signature. Callum walked toward the private elevator, his stride heavy and rhythmic. "Where are you going?" Ellie called out, her heart hammering against her ribs. "To see a man about a port," Callum said, the elevator doors sliding open with a hiss. "And then, I'm going to teach your ex-husband a lesson about the cost of an education." The air inside the private conference room on the 41st floor didn't circulate. It just sat there, heavy. Expensive. Thomas Vance didn't sit in his chair. He paced. He was a younger, rougher version of his brother, with a scar tracking along his jawline that turned white when his temper flared. Right now, it was a blinding, jagged streak against his skin. Pressing. "Cal," Thomas said, tossing a matte black tablet onto the glass table. Reznov's people are pushing the perimeter at the south side yards. They not using their own muscle. They reusing local crews, clean cut, burner cars. Callum sat at the head of the table. His hands were flat on the leather blotter. He didn't look at the tablet. He looked at the window. Outside, the Chicago gray was turning into a slate-colored twilight. "They retesting the structural integrity of the line," Callum said. His voice was a steady rhythmic rasp. "Dmitri doesn't want a war. War is expensive. War invites the feds. He wants to see if I am willing to bleed for a charity bookkeeper." Ellie stood by the glass partition that separated Callum's office from the main bullpen. She had been given a new pair of clothes, a dark charcoal sweater that smelled of cedar and wool trousers that actually fit her waist. But she felt small. A sparrow trapped in an engine room. Thomas stopped pacing. He leaned over the table, his knuckles pressing into the wood. "We need to drop the ledger to the state's attorney. Let them handle Hart. Clean our hands of the girl." Callum didn't move a muscle. He didn't blink. "If we hand the ledger over now, Thomas, the state's attorney freezes the assets of the foundation," Callum said. "Every single dollar meant for those classrooms in Southside disappears into an escrow account for 5 years. The people who are trying to learn how to read so they can buy a house or understand their medical bills get locked out. You don't defeat an oppressor by sacrificing the very people they were oppressing. That isn't strategy. That's a moral default." Thomas let out a short, harsh breath. "And if Reznov takes the port, he won't take the port," Callum said. He stood up. He was a massive shadow against the glass. "Because Reznov is a transactional animal. He only understands the language of profit and loss. We need to alter the cost of his investment." He turned his gray eyes to Ellie. "Thomas is going to the university. Your sister is being moved to a safe house in Munster. Out of state. Out of Reznov's municipal reach." "Does she know?" Ellie asked. Her throat felt dry. "She knows she is getting a free weekend at a cabin," Callum said. "She thinks it is a gift from the medical school board. Let her keep that reality for as long as she can." The warehouse at the West Side rail yard was older than Callum's empire. The brick was black from a century of coal soot, and the iron rafters groaned under the weight of the lake wind. 2 cars were parked inside the massive, echoing bay. Callum's armored SUV and a silver Mercedes that belonged to Reznov's chief lieutenant. A man named Yuri, who looked like a high school principal, and killed people with the indifference of a man stepping on an ant. Yuri was sitting on a wooden crate, smoking a cigarette that left a sweet, sickly trail of Turkish tobacco in the damp air. Callum didn't bring his guards inside the bay. He left Thomas and 3 men at the gate. He walked into the center of the warehouse alone, his long charcoal coat open, his hands loose at his sides. "Vance," Yuri said, nodding once. He didn't stand up. "Dmitri says you're getting sentimental. He says a man who runs the port shouldn't be spending his capital on a woman who teaches the alphabet." Callum stopped 5 feet away. The space between them was cold, clear. Dimitri is looking at the wrong ledger, Callum said. His cadence was slow, rhythmic, word, pause, word. The ledger she carries isn't about the 2 million heart washed. Callum continued, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. It's about the shipping manifests for the North Terminal. The ones Hart drew up under your boss's direction. If those files hit the Federal Oversight Committee, your trucks don't cross the state line for a decade. Yuri's cigarette stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes narrowed. The principal facade slipped, revealing the wolf underneath. Hart didn't tell us she had the manifests. Hart doesn't tell anyone the truth, Yuri, Callum said. Because a narcissist doesn't have partners. He has tools. He used your boss's infrastructure to build his own exit strategy, and he used his ex-wife as the shield. If you think Dimitri is the one pulling the strings here, you've already lost the game. In my world, a man who doesn't understand the true nature of his alliances is just a carcass waiting for the crows. Yuri stood up slowly, dropping the cigarette butt and crushing it under his heel. What do you want, Vance? I want the probate motion dropped by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Callum said. I want Hart's signature on a non-disclosure agreement regarding the Open Page Foundation. And I want your trucks out of my South Side yards by midnight, and if we say no, Callum stepped closer. The light from the single bulb hanging from the rafter hit the side of his face, turning his gray eye into a piece of cracked flint. Then I don't give the files to the state's attorney, Callum said, his voice dropping into a register that made Yuri's shoulder twitch. I give them to the Internal Affairs Division at the Chicago Police Department. The ones you've been paying to look the other way at the docks. Let's see how long your infrastructure holds when your own guards start hunting you to save their pensions. He turned and walked away. His leather shoes struck the concrete with that same, unshakable rhythm, thud, thud, thud. He didn't look back to see if Yuri was reaching for a gun. He knew Yuri wouldn't. A transactional man doesn't shoot when he's trying to recalculate his margins. When Callum returned to the penthouse, the clock on the marble mantel was chiming 2:00 a.m. The apartment was dark, but there was a light on in the guest room. He walked down the hallway, his boots quiet on the runner. He didn't knock, he just pushed the door open 3 inches. Ellie was sitting on the edge of the bed, her laptop open on her knees. She was grading papers, digital submissions from her adult literacy students. Her face was illuminated by the blue screen, showing the deep, dark circles under her eyes. Clara is in Munster, Callum said from the doorway. Ellie looked up. She didn't look relieved, she looked tired. Thank you. You should be sleeping, he said. I can't, she replied. She closed the laptop. The blue light vanishing, leaving the room in the soft gray of the city night. Every time I close my eyes, I hear Garrison's laugh, that specific. Quiet little chuckle he gives right before he tells me I'm being dramatic. Right before he takes something else away from me. Callum walked into the room. He didn't sit on the bed, he stood by the window. His large frame blocking out a section of the skyline. He's using your memory as an anchor, Eleanor, Callum said. His voice was softer than it had been in the warehouse, but it carried the same unyielding weight. A man like that doesn't just want to win. He wants to own the space inside your head, so you'll defeat yourself before he even has to move. You have to clear the ledger. How? She asked. Her voice was small. 9 years. Callum. You don't just erase 9 years of being told you're nothing without someone else. Callum didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his own hands, the scars on his knuckles. The thick white line that ran across his wrist, where his father's men had tried to hold him down when he was 16. You don't erase it, Callum said quietly. You just outbuild it. You build something bigger on top of the ruins until the old foundation doesn't matter anymore. He walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the quiet hum of the storm outside. The sun came up cold and bright on Tuesday, casting long, sharp shadows across the white-sheeted expanse of Grant Park. Callum had given Ellie permission to leave the penthouse for 3 hours. 2 guards, men named Miller and Vance's cousin Silas, were trailing her from 30 yards back, their hands buried in their long wool coats. Ellie walked along the concrete path near the lake. The water was a deep, frozen blue, chunks of ice grinding against the stone seawall with a hollow. rhythmic groaning. She needed the air. The penthouse was a beautiful cage, but it was still a cage. And the air inside smelled too much of Callum's absolute certainty. She stopped by a row of benches near the old fountain. A man in a tan overcoat was sitting there, throwing pieces of stale bread to a flock of gray gulls. He didn't look like an enforcer. He looked like an accountant, mid-40s, spectacles, a leather briefcase resting between his feet. As Ellie passed, he didn't look up. He just spoke. His voice quiet, clipping through the wind. "Miss Crawford," the man said. "Don't look at me. Just listen to the birds." Ellie slowed her pace. Her hand went to the pocket of her coat, her fingers tightening around the small pepper spray she'd kept from her old life. "Who are you?" "My name is Marcus Webb," the man said. He threw another piece of bread. "I'm an independent investigator. I work for people who want to keep Chicago clean. People who don't like Callum Vance. I have guards," Ellie said, her eyes tracking Miller, who was standing by a light pole 50 feet away, his gaze scanning the tree line. "Your guards are looking for guns, Miss Crawford. They're not looking for information," Webb said. He reached into his coat, pulled out a large white glassine envelope, and slid it along the wooden slats of the bench. "Take it. Or don't. But if you want to know what happened to your grandmother's trust fund 3 weeks ago, you'll look inside." Ellie hesitated. The wind off the lake caught her hair, whipping it across her face. She thought of Callum. She thought of his quiet, rhythmic hands wrapping her palm in gauze. She thought of his voice in the dark, telling her she was a person, not a pawn. But she also thought of Garrison. She thought of how many times she had trusted a man because he felt like a wall, only to find out the wall was designed to lock her in. She reached down, her fingers catching the edge of the envelope, and slid it into her bag. Webb didn't say another word. He stood up, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward Michigan Avenue, his shoes making no sound on the salted path. The guest room was silent when she returned. Ellie sat at the small writing desk, the white envelope open before her. Inside were 7 high-gloss photographs. They weren't grainy surveillance shots. They were crisp, clear, professional. The first photo was taken inside the Prime Cut, an exclusive reservation-only steakhouse in River North, where corporate executives and politicians went to disappear. Callum Vance was sitting at a corner table. Opposite him, looking relaxed, a glass of 20-year-old scotch in his hand, was Garrison Hart. The timestamp on the bottom corner read, November 4th, 8:14 p.m., 3 weeks before Ellie had found the ledger. 3 weeks before she had run for her life. The second photo showed Callum sliding a thick, cream-colored document folder across the white tablecloth toward Garrison. Garrison was smiling, that specific, condescending tilt of his head that meant he just won a negotiation without having to raise his voice. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her hands went cold. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in until the air felt thick as grease. She looked at the photos again, her eyes tracking the lines of Callum's face. He looked exactly the same as he did when he sat across from her in the library, calm, clinical, in total control. She had been set up. The whole thing, the ledger, the chase in the garage, the safe house for Clara. It wasn't a rescue, it was a play. A chess match between 2 powerful men who used her as the board. Callum hadn't found the missing link through her ledger. He had used her ledger to cover his own tracks with Garrison. The trauma of 9 years didn't just return. It exploded through her chest. The self-doubt. The sickening realization that her instincts were broken. That she was an easy mark for men who spoke in the cadence of authority. She stood up, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She took the photos, her fingers crushing the edges, and walked straight down the hallway toward Callum's private office. She didn't knock. She threw the doors open. Callum was sitting behind his walnut desk, a red pen in his hand, correcting a contract template. He looked up, his gray eyes registering her arrival with that same, unblinking stillness. Ellie slammed the photos down onto his blotter. One of them slid across the polished wood, stopping right against his silver cufflink. "You met him," Ellie said. Her voice didn't shake. It was hard, sharp. A knife drawn in a dark room. Callum looked down at the photo of himself and Garrison. His face didn't move, no twitch in the jaw, no widening of the eyes. He just looked at it for 3 long beats, then looked up at her. Yes, Callum said. 3 weeks ago, she said, her chest heaving. Before I found the books, before you took me into your car. You knew him. You were working with him. I was negotiating with him, Callum corrected her. His voice was a steady, flat line. He was representing a developer who wanted the rail yards. I needed to see what he had. You used me, she whispered. The words felt like sand in her mouth. You let me think I was safe here. You let me think you cared about my sister's autonomy. But you read just like him, aren't you? You just use different words. You look at a woman who has been broken down and you see an asset, an entry on a balance sheet. You didn't save me from Garrison, Callum. You just bought my debt from him. Callum stood up slowly. He didn't lean over the desk. He stood straight, his presence filling the space between them like a thundercloud. You re-letting your past dictate your vision, Eleanor, Callum said, his cadence slowing down until every word was a deliberate hammer blow. Word. Pause. Word. I met with heart because that is how business is conducted in this city. You don't defeat an enemy by ignoring him. You sit across from him and you count his teeth. I didn't tell you about the meeting because you weren't ready to handle the scope of what he was doing. My silence wasn't a betrayal. It was a perimeter. If you want to believe that every man who steps into your life is a monster out to destroy you, that is your choice. But in this room, the only person took your power right now is you. Because you're choosing to trust a shadow in a park over the man who kept your sister alive. Ellie looked at him. The gray in his eyes was magnificent, cold, flawless. But she didn't see protection anymore. She saw the wall. The beautiful, terrifying wall that locked her away from her own life. Your perimeter feels a lot like a cell, Mr. Vance, Ellie said. Her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the silence of the room. And I've Eisen already spent 9 years in a cell with a better view. She turned around and walked out of the office. Her boots clicking against the marble. Each step a rhythmic declaration of her own return to the dark. Callum didn't follow her. He stood behind his desk, his hand resting on the photo of Garrison Hart, his face a monument of stone that had forgotten how to ask someone to stay. The stairwell of Meridian Tower was cold. It wasn't the managed chill of the penthouse. It was raw, industrial, and heavy with the scent of dry concrete and old iron paint. Ellie sat on the bottom step of the 47th floor fire exit. Her coat was pulled tight around her. Her knees were drawn up to her chest. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were fixed on the heavy steel door across the landing. She just wanted to breathe air that didn't cost $1 million a square foot. The heavy door groaned. It didn't slam. It clicked open, the sound echoing upward into the dark shaft of the stairwell. Callum Vance stepped onto the concrete landing. He had left his suit jacket inside. His white shirt was a stark, bright shape against the gray walls. He didn't look down at her. He walked to the heavy iron handrail, his large, scarred hands gripping the metal. The air is thinner out here, Callum said. His voice was a low scraping rasp. It's honest, Ellie said. She didn't look up. It does to pretend to be a sanctuary. Callum turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the dim fluorescent bulb overhead. You think I lied to you. I think you let me believe what was convenient for you, she said. Her voice was flat, sharp. That's Garrison's favorite game. He never lied. He just built a house out of half-truths and watched me live in it until the roof fell in. You knew him, Callum. You sat across from him, you saw what he was, and you didn't say a word. Callum let go of the rail. He walked down the 3 concrete steps, his heavy boots making a slow rhythmic thud. Thud, pause. Thud. He didn't stop until he was standing 2 feet from her. He didn't bend down. He stood straight. A massive shadow cutting off the draft from the upper floors. I saw a corporate thief with an expensive haircut, Callum said. His cadence was deliberate, slow. I see 5 of them every week at the Chicago club. They think because they have a license to practice law. Their cruelty is civilized. I didn't tell you about the meeting because it wasn't your fight yet, Eleanor. It was always my fight, Ellie whispered, her head snapping up, her hazel eyes locking onto his. He took 9 years of my life. He made me feel like an idiot for wanting to teach people how to read instead of buying a condo in Gold Coast. You don't get to decide when I'm allowed to stand up. Callum looked down at her. The flint in his eyes seemed to fracture, just for a second. You think standing up is about having all the pieces of the puzzle, Callum said. His voice was a low, resonant vibration. It isn't. Standing up is about deciding that nobody else gets to hold the pen while your story is being written. I didn't keep those photos from you to make you feel small. I kept them because, in my world, if you show your anger too early, your enemy knows exactly where to aim. True autonomy isn't just about knowing the truth. It's about having the discipline to use that truth when it actually carries weight. I don't apologize for my silence, Eleanor. I apologize for forgetting that you've been fighting your own war long before you met me. The silence that followed was heavy. It filled the stairwell like water. Ellie looked at his hands, the white scar across his wrist. She understood what he was saying. She understood the logic. But understanding a wall doesn't mean you want to live inside it. I need to go, she said slowly. Not because I don't believe you, but because if I stay in this building, I'm just changing keepers. I need to see Clara myself, without your men standing between us. Callum didn't move for 3 long beats. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his radio. Thomas, prep the secondary transport. Take her to the safe house in Munster. No tail, just Silas at the wheel. He looked back at Ellie. Silas will stay at the gate. He won't enter the house. The rest is yours. Thank you, she said. Callum didn't answer. He turned and walked back up the concrete steps, his shadow disappearing behind the heavy steel door before she even stood up. The road to Munster was a black ribbon of wet asphalt under a sky that looked like bruised iron. The snow had stopped, but the wind off the lake was still pushing the SUV sideways every time they crossed an overpass. Silas was quiet. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, respecting the silence that Ellie had pulled around herself like a blanket. They passed the industrial flats of Gary. The smoke from the steel mills was a heavy, orange glow against the low clouds. Just past the state line, on a 2-lane road lined with dead oaks and frozen ditches, the headlights behind them flared. A heavy black SUV came out of the dark, its high beams blinding in Silas's rearview mirror. Then another. Silas, Ellie said, her hand instantly going to her seatbelt. I see him, ma'am, Silas said. His voice was tight. Hold on. The lead SUV didn't try to pass. It rammed their rear bumper. The impact was a violent, metal-on-metal screech that sent the heavy vehicle fishtailing across the black ice. Silas spun the wheel, his muscles straining against the column, trying to find traction. The second SUV pulled parallel, its heavy reinforced grille slamming into the passenger side door. The glass shattered. A spray of frozen diamonds exploded across the cabin, cutting Ellie's cheek. The world went sideways. The SUV hit the ditch, rolling once before coming to a violent groaning halt against a concrete culvert. The silence came back first. The smell of hot antifreeze and deployed airbags. Ellie was hanging upside down, her chest pinned by the seatbelt. Her head was pounding, a warm trickle of blood running into her eyebrows. Through the smashed windshield, she saw boots. Silas was slumped over the wheel, unconscious, his breath shallow but steady. The door on her side was wrenched open with a horrific, screeching tear of iron. A man reached in. He didn't use the rough grip of a cartel enforcer. He unbuckled her belt with practiced efficiency, letting her drop hard onto the broken glass before dragging her out into the freezing mud. She looked up through the blur of blood and snow. Garrison Hart was standing there. He was wearing his charcoal cashmere overcoat. His leather gloves were spotless. He looked down at her, and then he let out that quiet, rhythmic little laugh. Huh, pause. Huh, look at you, Ellie, Garrison said. He shook his head, a look of genuine amusement on his face. 9 years, I tried to teach you how the world actually works. I tried to give you a life that mattered. And the moment you leave, you throw yourself into a ditch for a criminal who doesn't even know your middle name. Ellie tried to stand, her boots slipping in the frozen slush. Garrison didn't help her up. He just watched her struggle, his hands buried deep in his pockets. You always had this pathetic delusion about your own independence, Garrison said, his voice smooth, conversational, completely devoid of empathy. You think you're a hero because you grade papers for people who can't read the back of a soup can, but you're just a marker on a board. Ellie, Vance doesn't want you. He wants the port manifests I drew up for Reznov. You were just the delivery girl. Now get in the car before I have my friends leave Silas in the ditch. Ellie wiped the blood from her eye. She looked at her ex-husband, the perfect hair, the pristine coat, the total emptiness behind his smile. She didn't feel the old fear. She didn't feel the sudden urge to apologize for making a mess. She stood up, her spine straight, her hazel eyes steady despite the blood. "You're still laughing," Garrus, Ellie said, her voice dropping into a low, quiet rhythm that sounded exactly like the wind off the lake. "But you're the only one who can't hear how hollow the sound is." One of the men in the dark jackets grabbed her arm from behind, shoving her into the rear seat of the black SUV. The door slammed shut, the expensive lock clicking into place with a sound that felt like the end of the world. The room did not have a window. It was an old Foreman S office, inside a decommissioned rail repair shop somewhere near Calumet City. The walls were corrugated tin, painted a faded industrial green that was peeling off in long, curled scabs. A single fluorescent fixture hung from a rusted chain overhead, humming with a dry rhythmic buzz that vibrated through Ellie's teeth. Bzzzt. Pause. Bzzzt. Ellie sat on a metal folding chair. Her hands weren't tied. Garrison hadn't bothered with ropes. In his mind, an elementary school teacher from the suburbs didn't possess the physical or mental capacity to challenge a steel door and two men with semi-automatics standing 40 feet away in the main bay. It was the classic error of the narcissist. He believed that because she didn't wield his kind of loud institutional power, she didn't wield any power at all. Ellie kept her hands in her lap. Her palm the scrape Callum had wrapped 4 days ago was throbbing beneath the dirty gauze. She used the pain. She used it to keep her mind sharp, tracking the sounds outside the room. Every 45 minutes, the footsteps outside changed weight. The heavy, flat-soled boots of the older guard were replaced by the lighter, fast-paced stride of the younger one. Two men, she noted, one smoker, one who keeps checking his watch. Garrison walked into the room at 4:00 a.m. He had taken off his overcoat, appearing in his tailored suit vest, his silver silk tie perfectly knotted. He carried a legal pad and a silver Mont Blanc pen. He sat across from her at the battered metal desk, setting the pad down with a soft click. "The 48 hours are ticking, Ellie," Garrison said. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man preparing for a routine deposition. "Colin Vance has your ledger, but more importantly, he has the encryption keys for the North Terminal shipping manifests. He is going to sign them over to Reznov's intermediaries, or I am going to introduce your sister's name to a federal grand jury." Ellie looked at the silver pen. "You ruined the charity, Garrison. You took money that was meant for textbooks and childcare for mothers who work the night shift." "Why?" Garrison let out that brief, dry chuckle again. "Because those mothers aren't a growth market, Ellie," Garrison said. He clicked the pen, the sound sharp in the tiny room. "The world doesn't reward charity, it rewards infrastructure. I used the Open Page Foundation because it was an unregulated conduit. I didn't ruin it, I optimized it. You think you're better than me because you live in a drafty apartment and sacrifice yourself for people who don't even have a bank account. But that isn't morality, Ellie, that's just fear. You re-terrified of actual competition. So you hide in a classroom where you always the smartest person in the room." Ellie leaned forward. She didn't flinch from the bright fluorescent light. She looked directly into the dark, empty centers of his eyes. "You think my life is small because it doesn't have a logo on it," Ellie said. Her cadence was slow, rhythmic, matching the steady buzz of the overhead light. "But I watched you for 9 years, Garrison. I watched you come home every night and look in the mirror to make sure you were still there. You don't care about infrastructure. You care about compliance. You use the law the way a bully uses a stick. Because if people stop looking at your credentials, they'll see that there's absolutely nothing inside the suit. You didn't optimize my charity. You infested it because you knew you weren't strong enough to build something of your own without stealing the foundation from a woman you thought wouldn't fight back." Garrison's smile didn't slip, but the skin around his knuckles turned a sharp, bloodless white as he gripped the silver pen. He stood up slowly, tapping the legal pad against his palm. "Vance isn't coming for you, Ellie," he said, his voice dropping its conversational warmth. "He's a businessman. He's going to run the numbers on your life, and he's going to realize the margin isn't worth the port. By tomorrow morning, you're going to be a footnote in a federal indictment." He walked out, the heavy tin door rattling into its frame. Ellie sat alone for 5 minutes. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her mind was clear, clear the ledger. Callum had told her, outbuild the ruins. She stood up. Her movements were quiet, deliberate. She walked to the small private bathroom adjoining the office. It was a filthy alcove with a stained sink and a rusted iron radiator that was cold to the touch. She knelt down by the base of the sink. The drain pipe was old, heavy lead, held together by an exposed brass coupling that had rusted through from decades of dampness. She took the dirty gauze off her palm. She didn't care about the infection anymore. She gripped the loose brass collar with her bare, calloused hand and pulled. The metal groaned. A jagged piece of the collar snapped off in her fingers, a 4-inch shard of heavy brass, sharp as a chisel on one end. She didn't hide it in her shoe. She slipped it into the sleeve of her charcoal sweater, the heavy fabric holding it against her forearm. She walked back to the metal desk and sat down. She didn't look at the door. She looked at the desk. There was a standard plastic-bodied desktop telephone sitting near the corner, its cord running down into a modular jack near the baseboard. The older guard entered the room 20 minutes later to drop a paper cup of cold water on the desk. He didn't look at her face. He was looking at his watch. "Hey," Ellie said. Her voice small, trembling just enough to trigger his instinct to ignore her. "The phone keeps clicking. Is someone on the line?" The guard frowned, his eyes drifting to the plastic receiver. "The line's dead, lady. Structure's off the grid." "No," Ellie said, leaning closer, her left hand touching the base of the phone. "Listen, it's making that rhythmic sound, like a typewriter." The guard let out a heavy, irritated sigh. He took 2 steps into the room, leaning over her shoulder to look at the device. He reached for the receiver. He was looking down. His throat was completely exposed. Ellie didn't use the brass shard to strike. She used her right hand to jam the plastic receiver down hard against his fingers, pinning his hand to the desk, while her left hand reached down and ripped the phone cord from the wall jack. The guard shouted, his free hand swinging around to catch her shoulder. Ellie didn't back away. She stood up into the blow, using her weight to shove the metal chair into his shins. He stumbled, his boots skidding on the greasy floorboards. Before he could find his balance, Ellie reached into her sleeve, pulled the heavy brass shard, and drove the flat, heavy end of it directly into the plastic housing of the phone base, smashing the casing until the internal circuit board was exposed. The green light on the board was flickering, a backup battery icon. It was an old commercial system, connected to the tower's local area network via a dedicated microwave link on the roof. Callum had explained it to Thomas during the meeting on Monday. The systems stay live even if the main grid drops. She didn't know the number for the penthouse. She didn't know the code for Callum's private line. She grabbed the silver Mont Blanc pen Garrison had left on the pad. She used the metal point to trace the copper leads on the exposed board, shorting the contacts across the primary emergency dial track, the old speed dial line that had been hard-coded into every terminal owned by Vance Holdings since the 90s. The board hissed, a tiny wisp of white smoke rising into the fluorescent light. Outside, the younger guard's boots began to click rapidly against the concrete bay. Moving toward the door, Ellie stood behind the desk, the sharp brass shard gripped in her right hand, her left hand holding the smashed phone like a brick. Her face was bloody, her sweater was torn, but as the door began to swing open, her eyes were wider, brighter, and more certain than they had been in 9 long years. "Come on," she thought, her breath steadying into that unshakable rhythm. "Come and see the lesson." The tin door didn't just open. It exploded inward. The younger guard didn't even have his hand on his holster. The iron frame caught him squarely in the shoulder, throwing him backward onto the greasy concrete of the main bay. He didn't get up. He skidded 6 feet and lay still, his breath whistling through a broken collarbone. Ellie didn't run. She stood behind the metal desk, her knuckles white around the heavy piece of smashed telephone. Her breath was coming in short, metered gasps, in, out, hold. Through the clearing smoke and the smell of ozone, the silhouette appeared. Callum Vance walked through the threshold. He didn't rush. He didn't look like a man who had just breached a secured perimeter in the dark. He looked like the winter itself, His charcoal wool mong toe coat was unbuttoned, the hem stained with slush and oil. His left hand was buried deep in his pocket, pressing against his fractured ribs, but his spine was a straight line of black iron. His gray eyes swept the room. They skipped the broken plastic on the desk. They skipped the blood on the floor. They locked onto Ellie's face. "You're bleeding," Callum said. His voice was a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to come from the soles of his boots. "It's not mine," Ellie said. She let the plastic base drop. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. "Most of it isn't, anyway." Callum nodded once, a microscopic movement of his chin. "Good." From the shadows near the back of the repair bay, a voice cut through the hum of the dead machinery. A high, thin sound. Terrified but trying desperately to sound like a man holding a winning hand. "Vance," Garrison Hart shouted. He was standing behind a rusted iron lathe, 20 feet away. His immaculate silver tie was crooked. His hair was damp from the sweat of a man who had just realized his calculations were based on an old algorithm. He had a small, nickel-plated revolver in his right hand. The barrel was shaking, pointing erratically between Callum's chest and Ellie's head. "Don't move," Garrison yelled, his voice cracking on the high note. "I have the manifests, Vance. I have the federal links. You step across that line, and I'll put a hole in her before your grease monkeys can clear the door." Callum didn't stop. He kept walking, his leather dress shoes striking the concrete with that same, unshakable rhythm. Thud, pause, thud. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't look at the revolver. He walked until he was standing 5 feet from the rusted lathe, his massive frame completely cutting off Garrison's line of sight to the door. "You're still holding the small gun, Garrison," Callum said. His cadence was slow, rhythmic. "A small gun for a small man who thinks power is something you buy at a boutique. I'll shoot her. Vance, I swear to God I'll do it." Garrison's finger tightened on the trigger, his knuckles turning a pasty, bloodless white. Callum stopped. He looked down at the nickel-plated barrel, then up into Garrison's frantic hollow eyes. "You won't shoot her," Callum said, his voice dropping into a register that made the tin walls hum. "Because shooting her requires a choice, and you don't make choices, Garrison. You make investments. You brought her here because you thought her fear would buy you an exit from Dmitry Reznov, but you failed to factor in the basic law of human value. A person is not currency. You cannot trade another human being's life to pay off the debt of your own cowardice. The second you put her in that car, you didn't buy your freedom. You just signed your own eviction notice from this city." Garrison let out a short, pathetic sob, his shoulder dropping an inch. "Dmitry told me Dmitry is dead," Callum said. The words were flat, heavy, like a stone dropped into a well. "He tried to keep the port terminals after the manifests went live. My brother Thomas is standing in his office right now. You have no partners left. Garrison, you have no legal motions. You are just an empty suit standing in a dark room with a toy in your hand." Garrison's arm began to tremble violently. The illusion of his perfection, the 9 years of high society smiles, the expensive defense strategies. The condescending little laughs shattered into dust right there on the concrete. He looked at Ellie, his eyes pleading for something she didn't possess anymore. "Ellie," Garrison whispered, his voice cracking. Tell him about the house. Tell him we can settle this out of court." Ellie walked out from behind the desk. She stood beside Callum, her shoulder nearly touching his long charcoal coat. She looked at her ex-husband, the man who had made her feel like a shadow for a decade. She didn't feel hatred. She didn't feel the burning need to see him bleed. She just felt an immense, clean space where her fear used to live. "There is no court left for you, Garrison," Ellie said, her voice matching Callum's steady, rhythmic cadence. "You spent 9 years teaching me that I was nothing without your permission. But the truth is, you were only big because you kept me on my knees. A man who needs to keep a woman in a cage just to feel like he's standing tall isn't an elite, Garrison. He's just a thief who stole a life he wasn't strong enough to earn. Put the gun down. It's too heavy for you." Garrison's hand dropped. The nickel-plated revolver slipped from his fingers, hitting the concrete with a sharp, metallic clatter before rolling into the grease under the lathe. He sank to his knees, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking as he began to weep, not for what he had done, but because he was finally visible. Callum didn't look down at him. He turned to Ellie, his large, calloused hand reaching out to gently touch the cut on her cheek. His thumb was warm, steady. "The car is outside," Callum said. "Thomas has Clara. She's already back at the apartment in Pilsen." Ellie looked into his gray eyes, the cracked flint that had become her wall. "And you?" "I have to clean the floor," Callum said quietly. "Then, I'm going to learn how to sleep past 4 in the morning." The hallway of Mercy Hospital smelled of floor wax and old fear. Thomas Vance was sitting on an orange plastic chair near the end of the recovery wing. His left arm was in a sling, a white gauze pad taped over the shoulder, where a stray .38 caliber round had torn through the muscle during the breach at the port. He looked pale, the shadow of his jawline dark against his skin, but his eyes were bright with the manic adrenaline of a survivor. Callum stood by the water cooler. He hadn't changed his shirt. The white linen was stained with soot at the cuffs, and the dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. He hadn't moved for 2 hours. Ellie walked down the hall, carrying 2 paper cups of terrible machine coffee. She handed one to Callum, her fingers brushing his scarred knuckles. "He's awake," Ellie said. "The doctor said the nerve isn't damaged. He'll be able to hold a steering wheel by the spring." Callum took the cup. He didn't drink. He looked at the black liquid as if he were trying to read a manifest in the steam. He shouldn't have been there. "I told him to stay at the perimeter." "He's your brother, Callum," Ellie said, sitting on the chair next to Thomas. "He doesn't know how to watch you bleed from a distance." Thomas let out a short, painful chuckle, wincing as the movement caught his stitches. "Listen to the lady. Cal, you re a great boss, but you re a miserable brother to protect. You think you re the only one allowed to carry the iron." Callum didn't look up from his cup. His profile was a hard, sharp angle against the fluorescent lights of the corridor. "When you carry the iron, Thomas, you carry the debt," Callum said, his voice a low rhythmic rumble that made a passing nurse slow her pace. "Every time we draw a line in this city, someone else pays the interest in blood. I built Vance Holdings so you wouldn't have to stand in a ditch in Gary. If you die because of my calculation, the Empire isn't a victory. It's just a very expensive cemetery. True leadership isn't about winning the battle. It's about making sure your family doesn't have to step over your corpse to inherit the prize." Thomas' smile faded. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers catching Callum's sleeve, pulling until his older brother was forced to look him in the eye. "We inherited the prize when you walked out of that house at 16. Cal," Thomas said softly. "The rest of this, the port, the buildings that's just concrete, stop trying to be a shield for the whole Midwest. Some of us want to stand in the rain with you." Callum stood silent for 5 long beats. Then, he set the coffee cup down on the plastic bin and walked toward the exit signs, his shadow long and heavy against the linoleum. The penthouse was empty when they returned at dawn. Martha had gone to Munster to bring Clara back to Chicago. The massive glass windows looked out over a lake that was turning from slate gray to a cold, pale pink as the sun cleared the horizon. Ellie sat at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, heavy cream, light sugar, a pinch of sea salt. She watched Callum. He had finally taken off his suit vest. He was standing by the glass, his forehead pressed against the cold pane, his large chest rising and falling in a slow, heavy rhythm. "Martha told me about your mother," Ellie said quietly into the silence. Callum didn't flinch. He didn't move away from the window. "Martha talks too much. She cares about you," Ellie said. "She remembers when you were 12. She remembers the day you forgot how to laugh." Callum turned around slowly. He leaned against the glass, his arms crossed over his chest, his linen shirt hanging loose over his ribs. The flint in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, dark exhaustion that looked older than the city itself. "She didn't die because of an accident, Eleanor," Callum said. His cadence was slow, monotonous. Sentence, pause, sentence. "She died because she wouldn't stop teaching," he continued, his voice dropping so low she had to lean forward to hear it over the hum of the refrigerator. "My father told her the South Side was changing. He told her the crews were using the alleys near her clinic to move the cases. She told him that a man who uses ignorance to control his neighborhood isn't a leader, he says, just a jailer with a larger key." She went to the clinic on a Tuesday. The brakes failed on the bridge. I was sitting in the back seat. I watched the water come through the floorboards, and I wasn't big enough to pull her out. Ellie stood up. She walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the marble. She didn't stop until she was standing inches from his chest. She reached up, her small hand resting against the side of his neck, her thumb tracking the heavy, pounding pulse in his jaw. "You've been trying to pull her out of that river for 28 years. Callum," Ellie said. Her voice shot through with that patient, rhythmic warmth of the classroom. "You built this entire fortress of iron and glass because you thought that if you were big enough, if you were controlled enough, the water couldn't reach you. But you can't outbuild a memory, and you don't honor her by turning yourself into stone." She taught people how to read because she believed in their freedom. She wouldn't want her son to live in a prison of his own making, even if the bars are made of multi-billion-dollar investments. Callum's hand came up, his massive, scarred fingers closing over hers where it rested on his jaw. His skin was burning hot against her cold fingers. He didn't pull her hand away. He held it there, his grip tightening until she could feel the heavy, unshakable rhythm of his heart through his palm. "I don't know how to stop the calculation, Eleanor," he whispered. His eyes were wide, dark, completely vulnerable for the first time in his life. "The numbers run every time the elevator doors open. I look at a room and I see the exits. I look at a person and I see the leverage." "Then let me teach you a different alphabet," Ellie said, her smile small but radiant in the early morning light. "It starts with an A, for autonomy. For the right to sit in a room without checking the locks. It's a slow lesson, Mr. Vance, but I am very patient." Callum looked down at her, the school teacher from Pilsen, with the cut on her cheek and the unyielding spine. He let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches as the final fracture in his armor split wide open. "The port is being transferred to a trust tomorrow," Callum said, his voice returning to that steady, quiet rumble. "Thomas will run the legal side. Vance Holdings is going legitimate. No more manifests, no more dark bays. And you?" she asked. "I bought a piece of land in North Carolina," he said, his fingers trailing her hair back from her ear. "The soil is sandy. Nothing grows there except wild oats and tomatoes." "I don't know anything about tomatoes, Eleanor." "I do," Ellie said, leaning her head against his chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of the man who had finally walked into his own life. "They need a lot of sun, a lot of water, and someone who isn't afraid to let them grow wild." The Atlantic Ocean did not sound like Lake Michigan. The lake was a flat, heavy iron sheet that slammed into the concrete seawalls of Chicago with a sharp, industrial crack. The ocean was different. It breathed. It had a long, slow, rhythmic sigh that rolled over the flat sand of the outer banks until the silence itself felt alive. It was 6 months since the 47th floor. Callum Vance stood on the wooden deck of the cedar-shingled house, his bare feet sinking slightly into the warm, salt-crusted timber. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet. The sky was the color of an old bruised deep purple, fading into a pale, watery yellow near the edge of the world. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt and linen trousers, no tie, no silver cufflinks. The chiseled stone of his face was still there, but the lines around his eyes had changed. They weren't tracks of a man scanning a perimeter anymore. They were softer, deepened by the blinding glare of the southern sun and the clean, uncomplicated horizontal of the sea. He didn't check his watch. He didn't have one on. Down in the yard, inside a cedar plank fence he had built with his own hands, the tomato plants were standing in neat, fragrant rows. The leaves were dark green, heavy with the morning dew and the sharp, peppery scent of growth. Callum walked down the 3 wooden steps, a yellow plastic watering can in his right hand. He knelt in the sandy soil, his fingers the knuckles still showing the faint, jagged white lines of his old life, gently lifting a low-hanging branch. "Check the stem, look for the worm, water the root." He moved with absolute deliberation, not the efficiency of a machine processing a transaction, but the patience of a man who had finally realized you cannot force a seed to grow by threatening it. The screen door behind him creaked open with a soft, familiar rattle. Ellie stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing a loose white cotton dress, her chestnut hair tied back with a piece of blue twine. She carried 2 ceramic mugs. The steam rose into the salt air, carrying the scent of black coffee. Heavy cream, and that distinct. Tiny pinch of sea salt she always dropped into the brew. She didn't speak. She walked down the steps and stood by the edge of the garden, watching him work. Callum rose slowly, wiping the dark loam from his palms onto his trousers. He took the mug from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was warm. The bandage was gone from her palm, leaving nothing but a smooth, pale pink line that looked like a crescent moon. The early girl variety is ripening, Callum said. His voice was a low, quiet rumble, stripped of the clinical coldness of Executive Row. 2 more days. Maybe 3. You're getting good at this, Mr. Vance, Ellie said, a small teasing tilt to her lips. It is a simple ledger, Eleanor, Callum replied, taking a slow sip of the coffee. You put the work into the dirt. The dirt doesn't lie to you. It doesn't try to alter the margins when your back is turned. He looked back at the house, the exposed cedar beams, the wide porch, the absolute lack of cameras or iron bars. The transition hadn't been a montage of effortless peace. The first 2 months in North Carolina had been loud with silence. Callum had spent his nights lying awake on the hard mattress, his brain automatically running the numbers at 4:00 a.m., analyzing the exit routes of a bedroom that didn't have a lock. His muscles would go rigid at the sound of a stray raccoon in the dunes. A 28-year habit doesn't vanish because you change your zip code. It stays in the marrow. It waits for the dark. But Ellie had been there. She hadn't forced him to talk. She had simply sat with him on the porch in the dark, her steady, rhythmic voice giving him a different map to follow until his heart rate dropped back to normal. Thomas called last night, Ellie said, leaning her elbow against the cedar fence post. The transfer of the North Terminal is complete. The foundation has its own independent endowment now. The classrooms are opening in September. Callum turned his gray eyes to the horizon, where the first orange sliver of the sun was breaking through the water. It's a clean break, Callum said, his cadence slow and measured. Thomas wanted to keep a percentage of the shipping logic. I told him no. When you walk away from a broken system, you don't keep a string attached just in case the wind shifts. True freedom isn't about having a safety net in the old world. It's about having the courage to let the old structure collapse entirely, so you can learn how to stand on your own 2 feet, without a crutch. If he keeps even one asset on the dark ledger, he is still a prisoner to the lifestyle. Ellie looked at him, her hazel eyes bright with a quiet, profound respect. He listened to you, she said softly. For the first time in his life, he didn't argue. He told me that he finally understood what you meant about the debt of the iron. He is taking Martha to the theater on Friday. A real play, not a closed-door meeting. Good, Callum said. He set his mug on the fence post. Thomas spent 38 years thinking that my power was something he had to copy to be safe. He didn't see the cage I was living in. If he can learn to live a life where his success isn't measured by how many people are afraid of him, then every single scar I carry was worth the price. Queen Bing dong the right to just be a man who goes to the theater without a security detail, that is the only inheritance that matters. He reached out, his large hand gently catching her chin, tilting her face up into the morning light. The faint scar on her cheek from the broken glass in Munster was almost invisible now, silvered by the sun. And you? Callum asked. The online literacy modules. Are they ready? The first curriculum is live, Ellie said, her smile widening. I have 42 students registered from across the country, steelworkers from Pennsylvania, mothers from the West Side, people who want to read their own mail without asking their children for help. You didn't leave the work behind, Callum noted. The work is who I am, Callum, Ellie said, her voice dropping into that steady, unshakable teacher-s cadence. Garrison thought my classroom was a hiding place because it didn't generate a corporate profit. But education isn't a commodity you trade, it is the restoration of human dignity. When you teach a person how to read, you're not just giving them a skill, you're giving them their voice back. You're giving them the right to look the world in the eye and say, I am here, and you cannot lie to me anymore. I didn't fight through 9 years of humiliation and a ditch in Indiana just to become a decoration on a beach. Mr. Vance, I came here to build an academy. Callum's chest rose and fell in a deep, peaceful breath. He reached down, his fingers trailing the white cotton of her dress until his palm rested against her waist. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Beneath the thin fabric, just below the curve of her hip, was a new, microscopic change in her body. A subtle, softening swell that only he and Ellie knew about. A new foundation being poured, quiet and invisible, on top of the old ruins. He knelt down again in the sandy dirt, his hands moving with that same, careful rhythm, clearing a stray weed from the base of the tomato plants. Ellie stood above him, drinking her salted coffee, the ocean wind catching her dress and sending it billowing around his shoulders like a white sail. The sun was fully up now, casting a long golden road across the Atlantic, illuminating the school teacher and the former boss. They had both paid their penance to the dark city. They had both stood up after being beaten down. And as the tide began to roll back out toward the deep, the only sound left on the outer banks was the clean, quiet cadence of a man learning how to live, one seed at a time. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.
And as the sun rises over the Outer Banks, leaving behind the cold steel towers of Chicago, the story of Eleanor Crawford and Callum Vance reminds us that not every battle is fought with bullets, money, or power. Some of the most important battles are fought quietly, inside the human heart. Ellie was never a woman who wanted an empire. She did not want control over a city, a port, or a room full of powerful men. All she wanted was the right to live with dignity, to teach, to breathe, to make her own choices, and to stop being treated like a small thing in someone else's story. Garrison Hart tried to convince her that her life had no value because it did not look impressive on paper. He mocked her classroom, her charity, her kindness, and her belief in people who had been forgotten by society. But what he never understood was that a life dedicated to restoring another person's voice is not small. It is sacred. Teaching someone how to read is not just teaching letters on a page. It is giving that person the power to understand a contract, protect their family, question a lie, and stand before the world with their head held high. That is why Ellie's work mattered. That is why Garrison feared it, because knowledge gives people freedom, and men who build their power on manipulation are always terrified of free people. Callum Vance, on the other hand, began this story as a man who believed control was the same as protection. He had built walls around himself so high that even love could barely reach him. He watched exits, calculated risks, and measured every room like a battlefield, because long ago, the world had taught him that vulnerability could get the people he loved killed. But through Ellie, he learned that a fortress can become a prison, even when it is built with good intentions. He learned that protecting someone does not mean deciding their life for them. It means respecting their autonomy, even when their choices frighten you. It means standing beside them, not above them. And perhaps that is one of the deepest lessons this story gives us. Real love is not possession. Real love does not cage someone in the name of safety. Real love hands them the key, opens the door, and trusts them to choose whether to stay. Ellie did not save Callum by becoming weak, obedient, or dependent on him. She saved him by standing in her truth. She challenged the cold logic of his world. She taught him a different alphabet, one that began with autonomy, dignity, patience, and trust. And Callum did not save Ellie by becoming her owner or her rescuer. He helped her survive, yes, but in the end, her freedom came from the strength she had carried all along. She escaped fear, not because a powerful man chose her, but because she finally remembered that her voice had never belonged to Garrison Hart. It had always belonged to her. This story also shows us that abuse does not always wear an ugly face. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit, speaks with perfect manners, and calls control love. Sometimes it hides behind legal papers, social status, and polite laughter. Garrison Hart was dangerous, not because he was loud, but because he made cruelty sound reasonable. He tried to turn Ellie's pain into weakness, her compassion into foolishness, and her independence into a flaw. But the moment she looked at him and no longer saw a giant, he became exactly what he had always been, an empty man who had only seemed powerful because he kept someone else on her knees. That is a powerful truth for every listener to carry. The people who belittle your dreams are often the ones most threatened by your growth. The people who mock your kindness are often the ones who know they could never survive in a world built on compassion. And the people who try to write your story for you are often afraid of what will happen when you pick up the pen yourself. In the end, Ellie and Callum did not find peace because the past disappeared. Their scars remained, the memories remained. The fear did not vanish overnight. But healing is not the absence of pain. Healing is the moment pain stops being the author of your life. Healing is waking up one morning and realizing that the old voice in your head has become quieter than the new life you are building. For Callum, healing looked like kneeling in sandy soil.